So thank you very much and welcome to the first session on why your health is about to change forever. This will be a positive session, so don't worry, there won't be anything about negative health outcomes. What I'll do initially is introduce myself and then the panel members. The panel members will then have a couple of minutes to introduce themselves, their company and their big thesis in this area. And then we'll start off discussing a few major topics which could well be why your health is about to change forever, including data in health, participation in health, the importance of financial health information, and also, finally, how to scale healthcare businesses. So I'm James Peach. I'm the Chief Executive of Centric Drug Discovery. We are a spin-out of Oxford University that does neurology drug discovery. So we are trying to invent new medicines for brain disorders, and we do that using real-world data, so existing hospital records, induced pluripotent stem cells, and genomic and cheminformatic data science. So I'll just briefly introduce the panel and then ask them to spend a couple of minutes describing themselves and their roles. So you have James Peyer here, who is both an investor and a founder of a company called Cambrian focused on longevity. You have Malievskaia, excuse me if I would get the pronunciation slightly wrong,
Perfect.
Who is both a clinician, an entrepreneur, a founder of Compass Pathways, and Charlotte Deane, who is an academic and also a commercial leader in an AI life sciences company called Exscientia. So James, why don't you start off, introduce yourself and your thesis in this space?
Sure. So I'm the talking head today to talk about longevity, which is something I think probably everyone in this room has heard about in one way or another, because we've made some really fundamental breakthroughs in the last 5 to 10 years in understanding what makes humans age, and particularly what makes us get sick as we age, what's breaking down at the cellular and molecular level. And I think the fundamental question that has motivated me to go to build my career first as an investor and now as a founder of Cambrian is asking the question, how can we take those breakthroughs in academia, right, this increased molecular and cellular understanding, and turn those into medicines that will really impact humans? The big challenge in aging and longevity is, how do you ever understand if a drug that might be able to slow aging in a mouse, how can you ever even test if that works in a human? Designing a clinical trial, which is the way that we have to determine whether something works or not, whether something is true in medicine, is not easy here. And so Cambrian has been approaching this in two, I think, positively interrelated ways. The first is that we realized that this whole idea of slowing aging is the wrong question and the wrong way to approach this field. It is instead about creating a new generation or a new type of preventative medicines. Medicines that can prevent diseases like cancer, dementia, and cardiovascular disease and frailty. And then the second approach is, if you look at preventative medicines of the past, whether for chronic or infectious diseases, they almost always start by by showing both safety and efficacy in treating patients today, and then move towards closer and closer towards treating healthy individuals. And so the theme as we talk about longevity is in this theme of how our health is going to change forever. These discoveries of what makes us age and what makes us break down as we age are going to be treatments first, and then they're going to become preventatives, but never will anyone say, oh, I'm taking a drug to slow down aging. That's just not how this is going to permeate and affect humans.
Thanks, James. And Katja?
Yes, hi everyone. I'm here to talk about mental health, and I know that we all bombarded by statistics of mental health crisis. 1 in 4 people live with mental illness in the UK, but I want to make it a little more visceral. By the time I finish this introduction, 3 people will commit suicide, will die of suicide, and by the time this panel is over, it will be 60 people who will die of suicide, and 120 will attempt suicide. So it's an enormous urgency, and we started Compass for deeply personal reasons. For me, as a physician, when our family became on the receiving end of mental health care, I realized that target-rich environment, there are huge opportunities for excellence. So it was kind of an involuntary startup, but now it's biotechnology company, UK-based, traded on NASDAQ. And our company focuses on accelerating patients' access to innovation in mental health. And we combine pharmaceutical agent psilocybin, active ingredient in magic mushrooms, with specially designed psychological support and digital tools. And the unique approach is that it's not something, none of these components kind of stand alone. They can stand alone. This is more of an amalgamated approach, and something that perhaps doesn't even have a name yet. I think the closest I could come to describing is it may be neuromodulation. But that's something that we really need to understand. Our first lead indication is treatment-resistant depression. That is depression that hasn't responded to multiple treatments. And these people are sick for decades. So we just published the results of phase 2 study that showed 233 patients, randomized control study that showed that 37% of these patients, after one dose of psilocybin, experienced significant reduction of symptoms or absence of symptoms, and majority of them maintain this improvement for 3 months or longer. So those are the results that I would say probably haven't been seen in psychiatry. And we now in phase 3. We have 2 other programs slightly behind this in PTSD and anorexia. And anorexia is the deadliest mental health, mental illness. And it hasn't been a lot of innovation in mental health. It hasn't been an innovation forever for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's really heterogeneous. And for us to understand the heterogeneity of these disorders, they don't have physical manifestations like cancer. There's nothing to measure. There are no scans. There are no blood tests. And for us to understand that, the role of data is really essential, and we need to think very carefully and be very skillful about data collection so we can catch up with medicine on precision, predictive, and preventative models of care. And second of all, the understanding of therapeutic targets and drug discovery is just not enough, because discovery is not innovation. Innovation is discovery operationalized. And that's why we have chosen to work within the existing economic and regulatory frameworks and structures, because for all their flaws, they're actually designed to scale innovation so we can reach as many patients as possible, as soon as possible.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katia. So you've already seen a couple of approaches to how healthcare is going to change. One around addressing longevity and moving from cure to prevention. Another around taking an incredibly difficult disease and taking a new approach of combining different areas to try and combat that disease. Charlotte.
So, hello. I'm Charlotte, and I guess I'm the talking head where we start talking about how computation, and people will always say AI at this point, will change all of this. So I'm an academic at Oxford, and one of the reasons I made the partial jump into working with a company is, I guess, related to what James said in his introduction. There has been a huge increase in the research that's around that allows us to see the power of the tools and techniques that I was writing academically, and so were my colleagues, and what that could do, potentially, and actually turn it into useful products to make a real difference. What I think is really interesting about all of this is that when we talk about medicine, we often forget kind of some very basic facts, which actually kind of are really important about how everything is done. So you can dress it up in different numbers, but roughly speaking, 10 to 12 years is the length of time to get a new drug. Could be a lot longer. There are plenty of diseases people have been working on for 30 years and we still don't have one. 2 billion, that's a good estimate. Some people put it up at 2.8, some people put it a bit lower. That means that you are really limited in terms of the kinds of things you can think of working on and who can work on them. I can give you another one. 9 out of 10 drugs fail after they have entered clinical trials. So not before that point, they've got that far. We really think they work. We've proved them in every possible way we can, and then we get them, the first time we get them into a human, from then 9 out of 10 will fail. What that means is that anybody in this industry is thinking about, you've got to have really deep pockets. Yep. You've got to think on really long time scales, and you've also got to work out if it's going to make money in the end, because that's a very expensive long-term process. There is a hope and a promise from using computational techniques that you can change that balance, that you could really change the balance of this. You could start to say, can we do it a lot faster? And that kind of relates to things like thinking about how you test and regulate drugs, how you generate data to do this better. Also, can you do it cheaper so you can make more diseases things that we would actually work on in these kinds of ways? So for me, the really exciting challenge is to take the kinds of, and I guess it starts in academia, but it's all over the place now, the breakthroughs we've seen in what computation can do for us to change the way we make medicines, to really make it possible, and I kind of like this phrase, it's not mine, to democratize drug discovery. So more people can do it in more places for more diseases to help more people get to better places.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So there you go, a star panel, and I will try and say as little as possible and get as much as possible out of them. I'll start off with the first topic I really wanted to touch on, which is data and how data will transform healthcare. And there's no doubt that it will. The issue we have at the moment is that about a third of global data is healthcare data. And out of that, and this first one is a legit statistic, I will give you an illegitimate statistic. I think the third of that, about 90% of it, we do nothing with at all. It is sitting in hospital records, it is sitting out there, no one's really computing on or doing anything with it. And Exscientia is an example where people are doing stuff with data. So I'd like to kind of ask the panel, I'd probably start off with Charlotte. How are you using and profiting from the massive increase in healthcare data that is going on at the moment, and how is that changing what you do?
I think that, well, I'm kind of going to wind back slightly, and it kind of relates to your comment about the data being unusable. When we talk about data and think about it for computation, but also general use, actually, just the fact that health records exist is no use to anyone. What you need data to be is in a format that it can be processed. And that actually turns out to be an incredibly expensive thing to have to work out how to do. And then layered on top of that, when you're talking about health data, and these guys will be much better at talking about this than me, of course you have the issues about privacy and the rights of the individual versus if I could access it all, I could do much better at working out what is causative for disease. The incredible thing about data, and I think the best way to explain this is thinking about, I suspect many of you have used Google Maps. And I suspect many of you have turned on the how long is it going to take me to get there bit of Google Maps. Yep. Where it tells you which route to take in your car. The reason it can do that is not because it's a genius, but because it has access to a vast amount of data, primarily from where everyone's mobile phone is, that says there's a big traffic jam there, there isn't one there, that road goes faster than that one. Not from knowing what the speed limits are, but actually from the data that it is collecting live and real time. And it is that kind of transformation you can imagine in healthcare if you have access to data in that kind of way. So it's the same kind of thing. You're thinking about, if I have that volume of data, I can then make much better predictions about outcomes. I can make a much better prediction about whether this drug will really work in people. I can make a prediction about things that I cannot yet test. And that gives you a huge amount of power.
So I really like the image of Google Maps, and I will riff on that to Google Longevity, which is basically, are we at the stage now where we're collecting enough data to be able to say to somebody, given your data footprint, you are going to make it to 74, and you will die. Well, we're not going to get that far, but where are we on that curve, James?
So a lot of, let's call it, population health and demographic work has gone into asking the question, where can we find health disparities? Right? And so as we talk about longevity, I think that there's really two conversations to be had. One is a health disparities and more of a social question, and one is more of a medical question. Can we find new treatments that can prevent disease and increase human health beyond the current capable amounts? And I think For the second question, that population health data is not useful at all, which is what my job is at Cambrian. But for the first question, we're actually making really big strides, right? There are enormous health disparities based on zip code in the US. And like you could have two neighborhoods right next to each other. And the biggest things here is access to good food, access to healthcare, economic level, prevalence of poverty and these sorts of things. As this large data question applies to my favorite questions about how do we really figure out new tools that can benefit society as a whole, the magical thing about the revolution that we're experiencing right now in data is the ability, at least in my view, is the ability to use slightly dirty or gappy data is getting better and better. So Charlotte just mentioned this a little bit, that like the data has to be in a form that is usable by a computer in order to be of any use to us. And so a big part of the computational work that we've done at Cambrian is creating sort of a data lake, a foundation where we can combine the sort of gold standard work that we're doing, where we're treating people in a placebo-controlled study with a specific drug so that we can really understand what happens, but then combine that with much larger data sets that are not placebo-controlled, that do not have a nice drug intervention, but can we still learn something about how people's biology is changing in different conditions there, and then combine that with our gold standard clinical trial work in order to enhance what we can know. And I think that's the way that, at least in my world, that the revolution that we're seeing in data is going to impact what we can do with the old school way of just thinking about clinical trials as its own little closed system.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And over the last 3 or 4 years, I'm getting a bit old now, a bunch of my friends have been diagnosed with cancer. And one of the very early things they ask me, obviously, is, well, how long have I got? And at that point, I can point to a clinical trial that says, on average, you're there. And they don't really want to know about average. They want to know about themselves. And therefore, that combination about the information about themselves and their own health disparities and the average patient who is in their situation is really, really important. But Katja, you were describing the need for precision medicine in your area. And say genomics and say cheminformatics is an area where the data set is very controlled. We really know the quality of the data where it comes from. Whereas in mental health, that's always been more of a challenge. Could you give an idea about how you think we'll get to precision mental health? Yeah,
so we are decades behind medicine, and we can definitely take inspiration from the advances of immuno-oncology and what difference it made in patients' lives in terms of survival and precision and understanding therapeutic targets. As a physician, I often think about Framingham study, which studied 3 generations, 14,000 people prospectively, 3 generations, in order to understand lifestyle factors, diet, exercise, genetics, everything else, and their influence on cardiovascular disease. And only when we had, start having data from this large population, prospective observational studies, we started understanding the pathophysiology, and we've made a huge progress with treatment of cardiovascular disease, and it keeps advancing just based on that data. And we do need a Framingham version in mental health, because we do not understand, genetics and environmental factors interplay, socioeconomic factors, social determinants of health. All that needs to be understood before we start even talking about precision. But when, the work that we are doing at Compass, what's interesting is, as I said, it's, the drug sort of has mechanism of action, but then there is a psychological support that, is provided by a specially trained therapist. And the value proposition of psychedelics is patients actually value their own psychedelic experience. So there's something therapeutic in that psychedelic state, in the experience itself. And what we've done is we've collected the narratives of patients before, during, and after, And we've looked at these narratives to understand the subjective mechanism of change. And what we just published the very first paper on that analysis, where analyzing voice, speech patterns, and some elements of narratives. What we found that what we call emotional breakthrough is in combination with voice and speech patterns, 88% predictive of response and maintenance of response. So this is very early work, and that's how we started thinking about this. So at least we can start moving towards personalizing the psychological support for these patients and potentially create truly personalized models of, talk therapy or psychological therapy. So that's very, very early. But of course, we need to understand, even in terms of therapeutic targets, we need to understand what drug works for whom, in what doses. And so we can actually do the interventions that work, and people don't have to wait 12, 14, 16 weeks to see if the, cheap antidepressant works for them. It works for many, but not for all.
So that is exceptionally interesting, because I think if I understood it right, we're now increasingly able to analyze speech and dialogue and quantify that as a intermediary outcome of a research study.
And the beauty of that work is that because psychedelics are rapid acting and episodic administration, it provides a unique model. It provides a compressed model of the disease. Patients are depressed, they take the drug, they're undepressed the next day. So we can eliminate attribution, and we can study this compressed model, and that potentially, in combination with exploratory endpoints, could give us an opportunity to create the composite markers that include behavioral, voice, speech, and biomarkers, because of the complexity of mental illness. So I don't think it's just one receptor or one neurotransmitter. I think it's a combination of factors that is predictive for a particular patient.
Brilliant. And when you mentioned the Framingham Heart Study, it made me think of another old study, the British Doctors Study, about 100 years ago now, which proved that smoking killed people. And it was a great study before pretty much computers were used. And so every year in the world, 60 million people die, and 8 million of those die of smoking-related diseases. So we're in a situation where our health is not just about the medicines we treat ourselves with, it's about the decisions we make about our own health. And this is, getting those decisions wrong is killing over 10% of the people who are dying every year. Massive, massive question. So this then turns us to participation in medicine, and how the fact that our healthcare is not going to be about people giving us a pill and walking away. It is about being involved in an understanding of whatever health and disease we have. And James, it'd be great to get your comments of that in the context of longevity.
Sure. I think keying off of what Katja was saying of this idea of the Framingham Heart Study, this is sort of the gold standard. I think the UK Doctor Study is another one where, as we study the history of how our understanding of health has changed, there are sort of two arenas by which we can learn things. One is these big studies where we try to pull as much data as we can together, and then the other are shifts that happen almost imperceptibly outside of the realm of running big academic studies. And I think over the past 15 to 20 years, we've seen one of these second types of shifts really take hold as people in really all of the generations, from millennials through baby boomers, are saying, we want better nutrition, we're going to exercise. Some are, some aren't. I think we have this disparity question that rears its head again. And then people saying, all right, well, now I want to track my performance, my health. I want to quantify how healthy I am in a day-to-day setting. Thinking about, like you were talking about with your friends, not just what's my diagnosis once I get cancer, but way before, 10 years before I get cancer, what's my risk of cancer? What's my risk of diabetes, risk of heart disease, all of these sorts of things. And so as we think about this larger topic of longevity, or as I like to just focus everything in on prevention, the question that we will have for ourselves is, given that so many people are now taking an active role in their health, smoking rates are still, a major killer, but they've also not been, like, they're falling off of a cliff, right? In especially the developed world. Yeah. And so now that people are taking more and more of an interest in maintaining their health, what tools can we have for those people to really deliver on the promise of prevention? And I think as we look at the kind of messy worlds of nutrition and exercise and sleep and these other things that we know work, but there's not like one system that is like, this is the correct diet, this is the correct exercise regime. We just know that in general you should do these things. Mapping that to the personal basis is one big opportunity for growth, but then the second one is going beyond that. How do we figure out what supplements someone should be taking? There are certainly beneficial supplements, but it's messy and it's probably individual. When we get into the world of drugs, what drugs will work for what people, in what contexts? And I think in that world, we're going to need to see an explosion of clinical trials aided by data to understand what really works. And so if I were to make a prediction about the next 20 years, I think there will be a massive proliferation in trying to measure, both in the real world and in the controlled clinical setting, how different interventions change physiology and behavior. And that will allow us to hopefully really learn something and not just go from fad to fad and trend to trend and muddle through in kind of a random walk.
That's really interesting, because that, I suppose, merges the social sciences with the traditional biological sciences.
I don't necessarily think of it as social sciences in that way. I think of it all as, how do we treat health? It's similar to what Katja was saying about mental health and how mental health is dramatically behind. If you look at what I would call integrative medicine, thinking about nutrition and diet and exercise and sleep and all of this kind of stuff, the amount that we really know about a recommendation versus the small molecule drug world, it's massively behind. But at the same time, we know a ton about things that work and things that don't, that can be applied in sort of a general and highly impactful way. And I think integrating more of that into treatment, into how the healthcare system interacts with individuals, is a fundamental challenge that we need to encounter or need to overcome in the next decade.
I think that's a really good point around the challenges we face when we are transforming health with the technologies that we have. And I think one area in healthcare, at least in life sciences, where AI has been having an impact for longer than probably most people are aware, is in cheminformatics. We've been designing drugs using AI for a long time. So Charlotte, from your experience, can you give us a bit of a how to do it, if you see what I mean? Because in your field, it has happened, really. It's accepted. People are using this. Do you have any thoughts or learnings about how do you scale those sorts of innovations and get them to the acceptability where you are?
I'm taking notes.
Yeah. I'd say you're not totally at the acceptable stage, depending on who you are. It's like everything when you're trying to change the way people do things. Actually, it isn't, I wish it was just a mathematical problem of demonstrating to people that this was fundamentally better. That's always what you want to be able to say. And you can kind of show the numbers. I mean, I'm sure people have seen the kinds of press releases, so not in the small molecule world so much, but around images where diagnosing many conditions now using AI algorithms is better than the radiographer or the doctor looking at it. Mostly. But even that is not necessarily enough for people to change behavior, because it is also a social problem every time. So in the chemistry world, where I've done lots of things, in lots of stuff I've done has been, you have this idea of, we have lots of data, we can make really good predictions about the behaviors of these small molecules, so you should let the computer tell you what small molecule to make. That's the sort of basic premise. But then you have a set of experts who've been looking at this for their entire life, and they go, but that's just wrong. And the problem with this is that both are wrong. So at the moment, no computer is 100% accurate in making a prediction about what would make a good drug for a given target to be able to do something. And no human is either. And because this is an expensive and difficult process, I can't take 1 million outputs from the computer and test them all, and 1 million outputs from the humans and just go, the statistics say computer's better. Instead, you're working on much smaller data sets, and quite often they'll go, well, we tested the computer and that one was wrong. And I'm like, well, if it's 80% accurate, 20% of the time it's wrong. So I'm a statistician, that's not a surprise. And I go, well, you tested one of yours and it was wrong. Oh, yes, but because we're humans. So actually, the acceptance in the field is probably the same everywhere. You think that it will be this logical process. What you're actually trying to do is build, and it is literally a real-world evidence base to change the way people think and behave to actually build these things into the system. It's not a case of going, I can do it better. It is a case of building it into what is a very large system for drug discovery, but in all the fields, I think it's the same way.
So building that evidence base behind the engine that effectively works. Katja, from your point on the, well, I suppose you've got two things going on. One is the mixed intervention, which includes the dialogue and the analysis of that. And the other one is the use of psychedelics. Can you think of what would be the ideal growth pattern for either of those, or indeed those together, which you're trying to encompass?
Well, I think there are two kind of distinct problems, and it's not only about psychedelics, but also what both of you mentioned, that there's a lot of interesting science going on, and we're understanding mechanisms, therapeutic targets. We're moving from receptors to functional connectivity, and just advances in science. But unfortunately, health systems don't automatically integrate the insights from Andrew Huberman's podcast into the clinical care guidelines. And so those are not interventions that will be adopted and deployed on population level. The other problem is that there are different sets of investors for different stages. So the investors who are interested in drug discovery are not the investors who are interested in late-stage clinical trials. And those are not the investors who are interested in in system change. So I think the challenge here is to how do we create the ecosystem of investors, government, science, academia, and businesses, that we can all be on the same side of the problem. And I think there is absolutely role of citizen scientists, and we do get signals of safety, efficacy, and other interesting signals from the field. But it can still only inform the research that is needed for the regulatory approval. And to make it even more complicated, the regulatory approval is not the end. It's just the beginning, because then you need to demonstrate to health systems that this is worth covering, because the access to care for patients with mental illness is not. It's the question of life and death, and those are the studies that are most expensive, most complicated, the longest, and the most difficult to do. So this is a complex system, and I think we need that sort of systemic approach, and that's why we have chosen to work with regulators, with an input from citizen science. And there is such thing as, I think regulators are increasingly more open to sort of consider what we call ethnographic data, signals coming from the trenches, from mushroom circles and things like that. But those are just kind of supplemental studies or information. But there is such thing as regulatory innovation, and I think regulators are people too, and they are, they have families, they have children, they suffer with the same problems that we suffer, and so we are again on the same side of the problem.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because you talk both about the investment side and the regulatory side, but you can see investors and regulators as hostile gatekeepers. actually deep down they're not. They are desperate to fund companies.
Yeah.
They are desperate to get medicines approved. So they are actually on our side.
Yeah.
However, the gates they put up make them seem hostile. And James, given your experience at Apollo doing investing, it would be great to get your kind of opinion on the healthcare investment scene today. My experience was from maybe 7-8 years ago, where we were incredibly lucky at Syncona when there was very little investment going on, frankly, and there were very few investors around. So we were able to find a gene therapy with human data. And it was just fun, which is great, we'll go. But now there's such a choice, and there's technological innovation, there's innovation in different stages of development. And how do you see, how can the investment community cope with this breadth and depth of what they're facing today?
So based on the explosion of what I would call translational science over the past 10 years, right? Academics and universities have gotten not just a little bit better, they've gotten an order of magnitude better at taking their basic science discoveries and turning those into not drugs, but what we call tool compounds that are then ready to be developed by a company, which means that there are close to an order of magnitude more biotechs floating around in the world than there were a decade ago. If you're someone with a bit of capital to throw around, whether on the investment side or a company like Cambrian that likes to partner with those academics and those small spin-outs, this is an amazing world to be in. There's been a contraction of capital for early stage science in the past 18 months, especially. And that's led to a ton of amazing opportunities. So at Cambrian, actually, we just partnered up with a small Swedish company that had been running on its own with a couple of academics who discovered a drug that is incredible. It actually seems to, at least in animals, deliver the effects of regular cardiovascular exercise as a once daily pill. So you can give it to mice, put them on a high-fat diet, they will lose weight. You don't give them any special training, and their endurance goes up, their cardiac capacity goes up. This looks incredible. And we were able to, thanks to the fact that we're sitting with a development team and a bit of capital, acquire that company to help them take it to the next stage. So this is an amazing, amazing, amazing time to be a capital deployer in biotech. But more so than ever before, it is a game of specialists. It is a game where you have to be able to pick the wheat from the chaff, because, and I say chaff with like big air quotes, because in a capital constrained environment, even good ideas that don't get follow-on fundraising will end up being failed ideas. And so we as an industry need to be able to ask the question, okay, is this a good idea? Yes, no. But then there's a secondary question, is that idea going to be marketable? Is it going to have a commercial outcome that will allow it to attract the funding to take the science to the next stage and the next stage? And you have to balance what we call that scientific risk. Will the drug work? With fundraising risk. Yeah. Will you be able to attract the capital to even test if that drug will work? And for the best drugs, what we're finding is, yes, there's always a path forward, but for worthwhile drugs that are one step down, that's really dependent on the macroeconomic status. And right now we're seeing more no's than there should be for good science in that one step back world.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult time for fundraising, but everyone expects that this is a dip that will come through at the far end, and there is a flight to quality and a flight to later stage data, as you say.
That's right.
So we're almost out of time, and I will ask the participants just to give their kind of one-sentence recommendation for the audience about why our health is about to change forever. But from my point of view, what I've taken from the sessions today is that there is an amazing richness of data available to innovators in healthcare, and this is moving away from the traditional clinical trial style data to other types of data, be that data in dialogue, data in the real world or otherwise. In terms of participation, it is very likely that the future of health will be much more around the ability to combine the will of the individual and their choices as well as our technology to give them a treatment or a cure, moving back from that treatment point towards prevention. From a financial side, it's really great to hear that there is a lot of hope and a lot of ideas out here, but as a investor, you're probably in a better position than a small company right now. These are difficult times. But just to kind of take the reverse order backwards, if that's right, Charlotte, I'll start with you. Do you have a kind of quick sentence for the audience here?
I think I would say your health is going to change forever. And actually, we're really lucky as people who work in that space because we have an opportunity to be part of that in terms of the way computation, the way data is going to change not just the types of drugs you have, but how they're delivered and how everybody behaves within the system.
Brilliant. And as we're over time, Katia and James, reasonably quickly.
Yes, I think we need to understand what mental health itself is, so we would know, and it's definitely not the absence of disease or absence of symptoms. We need to understand the destination so we know where we're going with this.
Thank you.
And I guess my super quick summary would be, right now we live in a sick care system that is building a bunch of new drugs to deal with sick people. And the biggest transformation we're going to see over the next 10 to 20 years is a transition to a true healthcare system where we understand what processes at the cellular and molecular level are breaking down in people who still appear healthy, and then using our scientific knowledge to prevent them from getting sick.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Katia. Thank you, Charlotte. Everyone, please join me in thanking the panel.